Good morning to all of you who are in comparable time zones to where we are. And let's do a quick couple of technical checks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I'm very happy to be back with you again to start off our last day of the week. It's been an outstanding week and probably quite an exhausting one for everyone involved. But we certainly, as James has already expressed, appreciate you hanging in there, sticking it out, sort of drinking from the fire hose, as they say, with working through all of the content that we've blasted through during the week. We are going to continue in that trend to start the day today with doing 90 minutes of a very new functionality, as James said, which is doing Boolean network modeling in CompuCell 3D using MaBoSS. Of course, we have the chat for questions, the buttons as well for moving along or slowing down, so on and so forth. So please feel free to use that to provide feedback as we move through this. We are going to spend the next hour and a half surveying what exactly is a Boolean network model in the first place, and what that looks like in the simulator that is integrated into CompuCell 3D, which is called MaBoSS. We're going to look at doing basic MaBoSS modeling and simulations in CompuCell, in particular focusing on taking Boolean network models and using them in a multicellular context with cells that can move and interact with each other. And we're going to do all of that within the context of building a simulation together. So we're going to do as we've been doing. We're going to start in Twedit. We're going to work through the wizard and build a simulation from scratch, and sort of work through some of the basic modeling ideas and some of the functionality that's provided both by CompuCell and by MaBoSS itself, and sort of learn those basic ideas in practice. So I have to provide a sort of starting set of caveats for this module. As James has said, and I've already said, this is very new functionality. This is very new content and modeling capabilities for many of us, for us instructors. This, as James said in the pre sort of introductory discussion beginning at 10 a.m., this functionality was released just a few weeks ago in the newest release of CompuCell, which is to say that all of you are the first group of people who have ever done any sort of training on this content. So I feel particularly privileged to be delivering this talk and to see how this progresses and see how this is received among all of you, see how this experience goes from an instructing standpoint. And with that also, though, comes the burden of that we have not really done any training within, say, the Biocomplexity Institute, in that while I have done demos of this new functionality with the various members of our group, to my knowledge, unless someone has gone off and done some self-study, I am the only person currently on the planet who actually knows how to use this thing. And so, while all of the instructors are available throughout this module for support with everything that we've been supporting with, if you're having issues with syntax errors or something crashing or so on and so forth, everyone is still here available to help with all of that. But when it comes to the actual details of using MaBoSS in CompuCell, currently there is only me. Again, to my knowledge, if an instructor has gone off and learned this and hasn't told me, please speak up, because otherwise we're going to have to operate on the assumption that when it comes to the actual MaBoSS functionality within CompuCell, we'll have to keep all of the support within this main room and during the talk. The exercise that we'll do is in part very simple due to this, to try to keep this very basic, keep everyone on track, stick to the fundamentals and not do anything fancy. There is documentation available to this effect. I'm going to put this link in the chat that's available on my screen right now. I'll point out that this documentation, while written, has not been formally approved in our review process. So if that speaks at all to how new this capability is, here is the link in the chat. So you can refer to that for all of the capabilities that are currently available in CompuCell. That documentation is subject to change at any point during the review process, of course. And this is also capability that's under ongoing development. So, new things may pop up from time to time in the near future, but you can refer to that for now. The Tarun asks which folder in the Google Drive has today's materials. So this will be, we'll grab the link to the root directory for the student materials. That's now in the chat. The slides for today are available under, I believe it's slides and then day 4. The final, I guess what you could call a solution to the exercise that we'll build as well. That's also available. So if we get lost or just totally derailed, or you have a power outage and get behind, it's totally fine. The end product of what we'll build is also available for your review, and you can find those. Yes, Giuliano has a link in the chat for the slides. That's now in the chat as well. Thank you, Giuliano. And lastly, and then we can move on to actually diving into this thing. I am not an expert in Boolean dynamics. I certainly have my math papers, but my background, at least in applied mathematics, is more in mechanics, dynamics, and then of course agent-based modeling. But the world of Boolean is very new to me. So I know that there are people who are attending today and who have been here this week who have been working more in this realm mathematically, and so we may come across questions that I just certainly can't answer because I'm still learning. And so for those of you who are more familiar with the mathematical details of these models, feel free to speak up in the chat and answer where I cannot. We certainly welcome that. Now, with all that in mind, let's actually do this. So a Boolean network model. We're just going to start with the pictures here. So look at this diagram here on the right. This is a network model describing the cell cycle. And if I'd not told you that this was a modeling paper, you might assume that this was something that was inferred from experimental data, in that someone could have set up experiments in their wet lab and actually inferred these relationships through various knockouts and so on and so forth, when in fact this is actually from a modeling paper. This is from a modeling paper using MaBoSS. And the whole premise of Boolean network modeling works with these ideas of Boolean networks. So in a Boolean network model, biological objects, say something like the amount of a species, like we spent lots of time with Josh and James considering yesterday, doing the ODE modeling using antimony and Roadrunner. The Boolean models are not so much concerned with what the exact value of, say, a species in a cell is so much, but more so interested in things that can be described in more of a Boolean state. Something like being activated with, say, a gene, or some sort of species that, say, is above some threshold to where it starts to begin to have an effect in some signaling pathway. Boolean network models consider biological objects in these terms. Something is either high, or say true, or say 1, or something is false, it has a state that's false. It's either low or 0, or off. And each of those objects in a Boolean network then takes the form of being a node within that network. Those nodes being depicted here in the network in the top right on the cell cycle model. They're just, these little ovals. They have their names. Those are the objects of the network. Each of them is a node. And then the network is connected through these various interactions. Is there a question? Okay, just wanted to check in real quick. So the network is defined with interactions between those various nodes. This consists of defining the logic of a node in that certain nodes can either promote or inhibit the activation of other nodes. And this is written in the typical form. So you can see self-inhibition here of cyclin E just by this notation here. And then interactions, say also inhibition by cyclin A, so on and so forth. And so the Boolean network models will actually explicitly write the interactions of the various nodes through logical statements. That something will change its state one way or another based on some certain set of logical, or some certain set of conditions that are written as a logical statement. And so to that effect, then the events in a network, the dynamics, is described as stochastic state changes, where during integration, rather than say describing the next quantity of some variable in an ODE model, instead what occurs is integration will go through and consider those interactions and determine, say, the probability of a node changing a state based on the interactions that's defined for it according to the states of all of the nodes that it interacts with. And that generates things like this. So this is a result from this cell cycle model work. And a network can then be described as something like binary. So you can arrange all of the nodes in a network in a particular order and then just write some sort of binary sequence that describes all of the nodes of the network as either being true or false in the form of 1 or 0. And you get all sorts of interesting things like what you could only hope for with a model on the cell cycle, that you get some sort of cycle where the network is moving through some sort of cyclic dynamics through the state space. And that looks like just a sequence of just a binary moving around in a loop like this. Boolean network models are very nice in that you can actually construct images like this, where you can go through and actually define every possible state in a network. And then you can define all of the possible transitions from one state to the next. You can do things like isolate what states are not achievable in the state space that's constructed by a network. Some people here, I'm sure, could tell you all sorts of other interesting things. I'm not going to dwell on it because I am not at all qualified to tell you all of the great things about Boolean networks. Instead, what I'd like to do is take this then into the realm of doing Boolean network modeling in CompuCell in a multicellular context. So when we
lots and lots of stamina.
David, can I ask you to mute real quick?
Olympic St. Charles in Eugene a few
All right,
weeks.
we got a little bit of noise here. Thank you very much. So when doing Boolean network modeling in CompuCell, we get a lot of additional modeling capability, and we have the opportunity to investigate lots of very interesting phenomena, in particular, because when doing Boolean network modeling, it's certainly possible to, say, construct a network that considers, say, multiple cells. So we may be interested in considering the interactions between two different cells, each of which has a particular network running. What's great about this sort of framework is that we can have something like what we've been doing yesterday with the ODE modeling. We can have, say, a Boolean network model described in each individual cell. We can then go through and define the interactions between those networks, intercellular interactions that affect those networks and those networks contribute to, but in a dynamic context. So cells move, cells' environments change, and they affect their environments. And so having the capability of being able to model those interactions in a dynamic microenvironment, and to be able to define the contributions, the emergent contributions in this case, of the Boolean network models on the changes in the microenvironment. That capability is here presented now in CompuCell and readily available. And so we can do lots of interesting things like that. In this case, this is something like a coupled model of the cell cycle model that we saw on the previous slide, plus delta notch modeling. So coupling those two via intercellular interactions, and then using that in a simulation of wound healing. So we're actually going to build one of the aspects of this model shown here. Particularly, we're going to focus on the delta notch side of this modeling project. And you can see sort of what this looks like. Wouldn't pay too much attention to this for now, because we're actually going to go through and do this. But hopefully by now this may look somewhat familiar. So you can do things like still looping over our cell list, every cell in the inventory during the simulation, and actually grab the MaBoSS simulation that's attached to a particular cell that we had, say, attached to the cell previously in our start function, and then go through and actually relate the various states and model parameters of the MaBoSS simulation for that cell to other things that we've been working with in CompuCell, like neighborhood conditions, concentrations locally around the cell that we may be simulating with diffusion solvers. Yeah, this is what we're going to do for the rest of our time in this module. So to sort of get started on this, MaBoSS has its own simulation and model specification, just like CompuCell. So we have our cell list, we have our way of getting our field secretors and accessing our fields, and so on and so forth, describing the size of our lattice. MaBoSS has its own specification that CompuCell supports. So we'll create or specify MaBoSS models in the same way that one would do so just using MaBoSS. MaBoSS is its own simulator. It's its own standalone package. I can't remember if I put the link in the chat to their project page, so let me just do that now. Here's a link to the project page for MaBoSS, so you can get their software through their website. And you can do all this sort of modeling and a lot more than what CompuCell currently supports using their standalone package. But the basic model specifications are the same. And this is what it looks like. So for a MaBoSS simulation, there are there are exactly two sets of specifications that are used to define a MaBoSS simulation. The first being a description of the network of a model. And that looks like this little code snippet that's shown here on the bottom left. And then there's a second one that is a simulation configuration. And that's shown here on the bottom right. Now, in the case of the network, you can see a sort of representative example here. So the network specification will go through and define every node of the network, and then define all the particularities of that node. In this case, defining something like a formal expression for the logic of that node that defines its transition, and then writing the rate at which the node state can change, whether going from false to true or from true to false. Those rates can be explicitly defined and even independently, and can be parameterized according to other expressions that are written in the description for that node. It can be cross-referencing from one node to the next. So you can write, say, something like the logic of cyclin A being dependent on the node state of cyclin B, things like that. Now, in the case of the simulation configuration, this is sort of defining everything else that goes along with a MaBoSS simulation. Some of the specification in what I would call MaBoSS proper is not particularly relevant to its integration in CompuCell, in that some things that are specified in a MaBoSS simulation and the standalone package will define things like the duration of a simulation. In the integrated form, CompuCell controls that, in which case the integrated version of MaBoSS will just simply ignore those specifications. More importantly, for our work today, the simulation configuration defines things like the initial state of each node, which you can see a pretty lengthy list. This is again for the cell cycle model, writing things like that the initial state, which is written as I state, of, say, cyclin D is 1, stating that cyclin D in the simulation will start as true. There's also the ability to, say, define model parameters that can be used to describe the rate of transitions of various nodes, and lots of other things. That all is specified in the simulation configuration. Don't get too caught up in the details for now, because we'll actually go through and do this. But most importantly, 2 specifications. One describes the network itself, and the other describes all of the numerical particularities and initial conditions, so on and so forth. Now, MaBoSS is currently an extended feature of CompuCell 3D. So we've recently launched a new set of libraries for CompuCell that we call CC3D Extensions. And this is the home for projects like what we're surveying today, in that it's software developed by some other group or some computing technology that someone else develops that we like so much and think would be so relevant to the modeling community that we've decided to write support for it in one form or another within CompuCell. The MaBoSS plugin is part of the CC3D Extensions library, in which case, for those of you who have the local install, you may find that MaBoSS is not actually built in to your installation, and that's intentional. Now, there's some additional work that goes into actually getting the extensions library. I've outlined the steps here for your reference, not to go through it now, but rather for your reference, if you'd like to go through and actually get MaBoSS into your local installation on your own. Of course, I'd be happy to help with that. So if you have any issues, reach out to me. You have my email. Rather, the NanoHub tool has MaBoSS automatically built into that installation. And so what I'd like to do for today is that for those of you who've been using a local installation, if you could migrate over to the NanoHub tool, if only just for this module, that would go a long way in expediting the process with spending as much time as possible on actually learning how to do this new modeling capability together in a learning environment. For those of you who may not have the link stored for the NanoHub tool, there's the link in the chat. So if anything, for the next hour or so, I'd ask that those of you who are using the local install would indulge me and migrate over to the NanoHub tool. We've got a couple more minutes before we actually start doing anything, so feel free to listen to me in the background for those of you who haven't actually gone through and set up a registered account there. Now, the exercise that we're going to do from here on out is a poll going, I'll say. Go ahead and leave that running. We'll continue to talk. So we're going to start on this exercise. And as I've already said, we're going to work on doing something like delta notch modeling. Yesterday, we did delta notch modeling with Josh using ODE modeling, writing an antimony model and defining interactions between a cell and its neighbors and how that affects the delta notch model running inside a particular cell. We're going to do something very similar to that for the next.
Hello. Looks like TJ's web connection may have gone down for a second. Please be patient. I'm sure he'll try to connect. Let me see if he sends me a message about it. Give me 1 second to try to see what's going on. Okay, TJ's internet is down. He's trying to get it back. Jim, are you on the call?
Yes, I'm here.
If TJ can't get restarted in the next 5 minutes, could you possibly take over and present now?
I'm
if
gonna
you're not
go ahead
ready,
Yeah.
Okay, in that case, that's fine. I just wanted to check as a backup. There's a question about demos ready to download. Let me see if Julio is here. Julio isn't here yet, so I can't ask that question. Giuliano, do you know? Let me check on the demos while we're waiting. Is there anything else anybody wants to talk about as a group? Since a lot of people have joined since this morning, maybe I can just reshare those slides that I was talking about for the hackathon. This is the era of Zoom. I just wanted to say tomorrow for the hackathon, we start at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. There's a different link, a Zoom link for the hackathon. That link has been shared in the chat. Giuliano can share it again. I'd ask people to go over their projects one more time very quickly at the beginning to help out people who are looking for teams. I'm also asking everybody to send me by email, or the best thing to do actually, put it in that hackathon document. In that shared hackathon document, if you have a team, give me a brief descriptive name for the team so that when I create the breakout rooms, people can find you, okay? That would be very helpful. And I also thought that for people, especially if you're not far along in your model development process, I strongly encourage you to read the very short one-pager called Thinking About Modeling Strategies, which may help you orient if you haven't done this kind of thing before. And then there is a more elaborate document which you can walk through that will help you define your model and goals called Workflow for Developing Mechanism-Based Computational Biology Models. I strongly recommend that. And then there is a worksheet based on that, which you can fill out to begin to flesh out your model. So I think that could be helpful for people. Somebody says, Polly says, I asked for these, how the hackathon work. Is there, would one person be on NanoHub and screen sharing, or is there a way for the team to work on different parts of the same simulation? That's a good point. There's TJ back. At the moment, there is no Google Docs for these simulations. Actually, if you we've been teaching modeling, CompuCell modeling using Twit. One advantage of using the Git editors is that they do allow you to do shared model development. The disadvantage of using the Git editors is that they don't have the code snippets, and they don't have all of the support that you get for specifically CompuCell modeling. And so if you're an experienced Git person and you want to use the Git editor and develop your models in Git, that's fine. But TJ might have a few words to say on that. But he's back, so I should let him take the session back.
Well, my sincerest apologies. I had my first internet dropout right in the middle of a talk, so I appreciate all of your patience. Maybe it's time for me to get a new internet service provider. For now, let's not dwell on it and let's just get back going. I will happily weigh in on the pros and cons of using something like PyCharm versus Twedit, and be happy to discuss some of the internal topics that we've discussed in the development of CompuCell, say maybe after we conclude with this module, or maybe in private chat or during the hackathon. So it's a very interesting topic that's near and dear to my heart as both a modeler and as a software developer. So, but I digress on that. For now, let's get back to the Boolean modeling. I'm gonna blast past all of this surveying and say we're gonna build a delta notch model, and we're gonna do that using a Boolean network model. So let's go ahead and dive right into that. We're gonna build something like what we see here with the patterning of blue, red, and green cells. We're gonna do that sort of visualization as well. So let's go ahead and start right in. If everyone could move over to Twedit. I'm gonna get Twedit loaded up for me as well. I'm just gonna start with a blank project. I'm gonna split the screen. And let's just go through this together. So let's start by creating a new simulation. So we'll go to in Twedit CC3D project and then new project. And let's give our simulation a name. I'll remind you, no spaces and no starting with numbers. So keep it all letters is your safest bet. I'm going to name my simulation MaBoSS Delta Notch, like so. So you've got your valid name in the simulation name field and specified a place to save it. I already have mine set up. Let's click next. And what we will build for this module will be a two-dimensional sheet. And so our simulation will be 2D, and we're going to cover the entire simulation domain with a layer of cells. We're going to do all of our modeling and all of our simulating just within this 2D sheet. So let's do a periodic simulation domain. Our cells are going to be about 7 by 7 by 1. So let's set our X and Y dimensions to 98. Z dimension can just be 1 since we're doing 2 dimensions. So X and Y dimensions of 98 and Z equals to 1. And let's set up our periodic boundary conditions. So for X and Y, we're going to select periodic for the boundary conditions. And then everything else we can just leave as default. So X and Y dimensions of 98, boundary conditions of periodic for the X and Y boundaries. Now let's click next. We're going to create a couple of different cell types here in the CompuCell sense. And we're going to use those to represent the CompuCell sort of interpretation of our Boolean network model state. And so we're going to do this in a very straightforward way and just give some cell type names that correspond to the state of our delta or notch network nodes. And so we'll give some cell types. Let's do a cell type called inactive. And let's add that. Let's do one named delta. We'll add that. I'm capitalizing my names. It's not important so long as you're consistent throughout your specification. Let's name one notch. And let's add that. And then one more, we'll call it both. And let's add that. And this is to mean something like expressing delta, expressing notch, expressing both, or in the case of inactive, expressing nothing. So if you have your cell types, inactive, delta, notch, and both, then let's click next. We're not going to do any chemical diffusion in this simulation, so we can just skip past the specification of chemical fields. So let's select next again. And we've got a couple of plugins that we'll need for this simulation. We will do a volume constraint. So in the middle column for constraints and forces, just select volume flex. We won't do any specification in Python on the basis of cells, so we don't need volume local flex. We'll just use volume flex. In the left-hand column, under cell behaviors, I'm going to do just very basic contact modeling. So under adhesion, you can just select contact. And then lastly, we will use one additional tracker besides the center of mass that's enabled by default. We're going to do some neighbor counting. So under the cellular property trackers, we'll also select cell neighbors. Again, if you make some mistakes here, no problem. Everything we're doing right here is completely reversible. This is just building the simulation for us. So no worries if you miss something here. All of the instructors are taking note of which ones are active, and we can get those set up should you find that one of them is not available. All right, so contact, volume flex, and cell neighbors. Let's click next. And we're done. So let's select finish. You can double click the item in the CC3D project pane, and we have our simulation set up. Now, let's start to configure some of the particularities. So again, we're going to have a two-dimensional sheet, and we're going to have that cover the entire domain. Our domain was 98 by 98 along the X and Y dimensions respectively, and then no considerations along the Z dimension. So in this case, let's move over to the XML script. And let's go all the way to the bottom. Should find things that look consistent with what you specified in Wizard. Cell type plugin, center of mass, neighbor tracker, contact, and lastly, the uniform initializer. Now let's go to what should be around line 93, and let's specify the box that will define where our cells will be seated, just again, going to cover the entire domain. In this case, for 98 by 98, our box min will be the lower left-hand corner of the domain, which is the coordinate x equals 0, y equals 0, and z equals 0. And then we're going to fill our simulation domain all the way to the opposite corner, and that'll be for box max with a coordinate of 98. X equals 98, y equals 98, and z equals 1. So our box is from 0, 0, 0 to 98, 98, 1. And then lastly, we're going to initialize our cells as all being in the inactive state. We will set up our MaBoSS simulations to reflect that, and that nothing will be active. And so in the case of the CompuCell side of this simulation, we'll go to what should be around line 77 in your simulation script for the XML should be for types, and we'll remove what Twedit populated for us with all of the cell types that we specified, and instead just initialize this aggregate with inactive cells. 0, 0, 0 to 98, 98, 1, and only with the inactive type. Now let's go ahead and save and then continue on. We are done with the XML, so let's move on to our Steppables Python script. Should be the third tab along the top row in your Twedit GUI. We're going to start by defining the MaBoSS specification. So again, MaBoSS simulations are specified with a network specification and then a simulation configuration. And we're going to start by defining our network. And our network will consist of 3 nodes. And we'll walk through this as we write our models. So we're going to implement these like we implemented antimony models when working with Josh yesterday. We're going to do this with multi-line strings. So let's go up to the very top of our Steppables script. Should be around line 3. And let's just make a little space. Let's just hit return a few times. We'll just make a little bit of workspace here. So at around line 4, make some space between the import statement and our Steppable class. And we're going to start by declaring just the start of a multi-line string. This will be the network specification. Let's go ahead and name this multi-line string BND underscore STR. You want to use a different name, feel free to do so. Just make sure you do so consistently throughout your specification. I'm going to name mine BND underscore STR and go ahead and start to declare this. And again, this will be a multi-line string, which is a set of triple quotes. You can use single or double quotes so long as it's the same in the pair. I'm going to use double quotes, so a pair of triple quotes. And let's go ahead and declare just our nodes. And as a reminder, nodes in a network specification for MaBoSS just takes the form like what's shown here on the right-hand side of my screen. I'm going to do this with you. So to declare a node, we first just write node. That's a keyword. And then the next thing we'll enter is the name of the node. In this case, we'll call it delta, no caps, just all lowercase delta. And then we can return and then just start a pair of brackets, curly brackets. And we can return that a couple of times. So we have node, the name of our node, in this case delta, and then just a pair of curly brackets with a little bit of space in between, and everything that defines what goes on with this node, at least in its internal description, will all go inside this set of curly brackets. Now let's do the same for 2 more nodes. The other nodes in our network, one will be notch, as you may have guessed. So after our set of curly brackets, let's return a couple of times and let's declare a notch node. So we'll do this by typing node and then notch. Again, you're free to name them however you please. I'm going to use all lowercase on this side of the specification. So node, notch, and let's go ahead and place a set of curly brackets again to do some specification for our node notch. And the third node in our network will be something to do with the intracellular particularities of delta notch signaling. And we'll just call this NICD. Those who are more knowledgeable on this signaling pathway are welcome to elaborate on all the nuances of NICD. We're going to blast past that for now, for the sake of actually being able to do this in time and say that it's important enough that it found its way into this model. So let's do a node for NICD. We'll just type node NICD. I'm doing all lowercase, and then one more pair of curly brackets. So our network has 3 nodes, delta, notch, and NICD. Declared it in a multi-line string. And as maybe some of you might guess who were very enthusiastic about yesterday's sessions with Josh, chances are at some point we're going to end up feeding that to some predefined CompuCell function to create some MaBoSS networks. For now, let's actually fill some of this out. So each of these nodes can define, again, things like logical statements that dictate things like the MaBoSS transition rates, whether from a low state to a high state, or from a high state to a low state. We're going to do this at least to the extent that we can actually write some expressions and then use those in other expressions within the specification for a node. In this case, we're going to write some very basic logical expressions. And in each of those nodes, we're going to do that by assignment to a node variable. This is a variable that's particular to the node, not to the entire simulation. And for each of those node variables, we're just going to call them logic. Now, the evaluated value of logic we'll use in describing the rates for the individual nodes. But for all three nodes, we're going to write a logical expression. We're going to name that statement logic. And in this case, we're going to write the following expression. So we'll say that delta will only go high if both notch and NICD are both low. I'm going to rely on some of the experience with Josh yesterday on delta notch signaling and try and get us through this. So we're going to say that for the case of delta, delta will go high when both notch and NICD are low. And we can write that with a logical expression like as follows. So we can say logic equals and not notch being written with just an exclamation mark. We use the names of the variables in this sense, they're actually referring to the state of those nodes when logic is evaluated. So when I say exclamation notch, what I'm actually saying is not the state of notch. And likewise, to do that for both not notch and not NICD, we can do double ampersand and then exclamation NICD. This says logic evaluates to not notch and not NICD. Now let's jump down to our third node, NICD. And we're going to declare logic for this node as well. So again, this is not the same as logic defined in delta. This is only particular to NICD. And in this case, we're going to say that the logic for NICD is just equal to notch, which is that the logical expression for NICD just evaluates to being the same as the state of notch. And then lastly, we're going to write one for notch. And notch is special, and hence have reserved it for last, in that notch will use a variable that we will actually specify on the CompuCell side of this simulation. And what we will do is we will use a variable that we'll refer to as delta underscore ext. So this is a variable that we'll actually set in the CompuCell side of these simulations, and we'll use that variable as set by the CompuCell side in governing the transitions of the notch state in the Boolean network. So in this case, let's declare another logic for notch. And in this case, we'll say that logic just evaluates to the variable delta ext as specified by the CompuCell side of the simulation if delta ext is greater than 0. This is also a logical statement, just like not notch and not NICD, or just like notch. In this case, we'll say that logic is equal to delta ext, and we can tell MaBoSS that delta ext is a parameter by first writing a $sign before naming the variable. In this case, $, delta underscore ext, and then make it a logical statement greater than 0.0. Now you'll notice I'm terminating all of these statements with semicolons. That is due to that this is all using C++ syntax, not Python syntax. So in general, in writing these expressions for the MaBoSS specification, you'll want to terminate all of your lines with semicolons. Question, can you repeat why the $sign is needed? Yes, so the $sign tells MaBoSS that what's been named here, in this case, delta_ext, that this is a model parameter. And this is a parameter that we'll actually specify a value for in the second half of the MaBoSS specification, which is the simulation configuration. But it's also something that we'll be able to specify in CompuCell as well. And we'll be able to change the value of delta_ext at every simulation step. So was there another question? All right. So $sign tells MaBoSS that delta_ext is a model parameter. It's also something that CompuCell will be able to pick up, that we'll be able to change in our step function. For now, we'll leave it at that and say that the logic for notch is dependent on whether or not delta_ext is greater than 0. So let's continue. And now we'll define the second part of the node specification, and that is writing the rate of transitions from false to true or low to high, and also what's something like a downward rate, which is the rate of transition from high to low or from true to false. And MaBoSS will understand these with the variables rate_up for the transition from false to true, or rate_down for the transition from true to false, high to low, 1 to 0. And so we can write these for each of our nodes. Let's start with delta. So we will have an additional variable that we'll define in our simulation configuration. And this will be something like a constant rate that will be applicable to some of the nodes in our network. And that parameter will be just called fast. So we're going to refer to another model parameter that we'll define the value of momentarily. And the name of that model parameter will be fast. So we'll also refer to this one with a $sign before it because it's a model parameter. Now let's start by defining our rate up and rate down, upward and downward rates, transition rates for delta. So let's go up to what should be around line 7 and return, and let's start by defining rate_up. And rate_up, again, is the transition rate when going from false to true for the state of this node. And in this case, we're going to say that the upward rate is fast, but only when the value of logic, as defined in the line before, is only equal to fast when logic is true. So the upward rate for delta will be equal to fast only when logic is true. Otherwise, it'll be 0. And we can do that as follows. So in general, we can write expressions that accomplish this by first writing the condition for the logical statement. In this case, logic. And we can refer to logic in this sense as follows. So we can first say rate up will be governed by some condition. In this case, logic. And then we'll write the possible values based on the outcome of this condition. So when logic is true, we'll have a certain value that's assigned to rate up. And when logic is false, we'll have a different value that's assigned to rate up. And in this case, and in general, we have the form. There's a template here written here in the bottom left of the slide. And the form is to first write the condition and then follow it with a question mark. And that tells the code to first evaluate the condition. And if the condition is evaluated to be true, use the first value that follows the question mark. And if the condition is false, use the second value, where the first and second values are separated by a colon. So when the condition is true, rate up will take the first value that follows the question mark. And when condition is false, rate up will take the value of the second value that follows the colon. Okay, so let's do that here. And in this case, we'll refer to our variable fat or our parameter fast that we've not actually defined yet. It's okay, we'll define that in a moment. Just believe me when I say that we will. We're going to say that when logic is true, rate up will be equal to fast. And when logic is false, rate up will be equal to 0. So when logic is true, rate up will be equal to our parameter fast, whatever it is when we define it. And when logic is false, rate up will be 0. Now let's write the rate for going from a state of true to false, a downward rate. And again, this is called rate underscore down for the node delta. And we'll say in this case that when logic is true, the downward rate is 0. And likewise, when logic is false, the downward rate is equal to fast. What this is essentially implementing is that when logic is evaluated to true, the state of delta will go high. And when logic is false, the state of delta will go false. And that's what we're accomplishing here. So rate underscore down equals, let's again use logic as a condition. And when logic is true, our downward rate will be 0. And likewise, when logic is false, our downward rate will be equal to our currently unspecified parameter fast. Now, we'll do similar things for our notch and NICD nodes. For our notch node, in this case, let's also define our rate up and rate down for notch. We're going to move a little faster now. Let's do for notch rate underscore up for our upward rate equals, and we're going to use the logic for this node as a condition. We'll say at logic. And in this case, rather than using fast, I'm going to make the upward rate equal to our other model parameter, delta underscore ext. It's a question about the syntax here. So for those who've used MaBoSS more than me, feel free to correct me. But in this case, logic here is being referred to as a node parameter, whereas the $ here is referring to a simulation, a configuration parameter. Yeah, most importantly, that here for like the case here with fast is not updated every simulation step, whereas here logic is updated at every evaluation for these transitions. Okay, so let's continue on. For rate up, we're going to say that when logic is true, our upward rate will be delta ext, our other model parameter. And when logic is false, we'll say that the upward rate will be 0. Polly asks, what are the possible states of the node? True and false. For mixtures of rates and so on and so forth, lots of complexity having to do with defining the transition rates, still working within the context of true and false. So these logical statements, transition rates and all of that can be arbitrarily complex according to the specification of the network. We're still working within the context of true and false states. And yes, the values here for upward and downward rates, this refers to something like the probability of a state change on the node for an integration step. So yes, that's exactly right. Values do refer to the likelihood of a state change. Okay, now for notch, we said if the logic is evaluated to true, that the upward rate would be our model parameter delta ext, and if it's false, it'll be 0. Likewise for rate underscore down, let's keep this one simple and also refer to our logic and say if logic is true, then our downward rate is 0, and if logic is false, then our downward rate for notch will be fast. Question in the chat, does indentation matter? No. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but no. Yeah, so this can all be done like that as well. Yeah. Okay, so when logic is false, or I'm sorry, when logic is true, rate down will be 0. When logic is false, rate down will be fast. So when logic is true, notch will tend to go high, and when logic is false, notch will tend to go false. Now, let's finish this with NICD. And NICD will have the same rates as delta. So for NICD's rate underscore up, we'll also refer to this node's logic, and we'll say that if logic is true, rate up will be equal to our parameter fast. And if logic evaluates to false, our rate up will be equal to 0. And likewise for NICD, rate down, say that if logic is true, our downward rate will be 0. And if logic is false, then our downward rate will be fast. So when logic is true, NICD will tend to go to true, and when logic is false, NICD will tend to go to false. All right, let's move right along. Let's very quickly, so we're running out of time at an alarming rate, start with the second specification of a MaBoSS simulation, which is the simulation configuration. Let's do this in another multi-line string. So below our network description, let's declare a second multi-line string. In this case, we're going to call it CFG underscore STR for configuration string. And we'll also do a multi-line string here. So a pair of triple quotes. And now we're just going to provide our model parameters that we've been working with, but have not declared, as well as the initial states of our network. And in this case, for the model parameters, we can again refer to them first with the $, and then say, let's declare fast. So our model parameter fast, we'll write $fast, and let's declare that equal to 10. And for our second model parameter, which again will be set in CompuCell quite a lot, we'll initialize that delta_ext, excuse me. We'll just initialize that as equal to 0. Again, terminating all lines with semicolons. So fast is equal to 10, and delta_ext is equal to 0. Second of which we'll be setting in CompuCell quite a lot. Now let's declare the initial state of our network. We can do this with something like an attribute, like we've been working with in CompuCell, where the name of the attribute for an initial state is called iState. And let's just declare all the initial states of our nodes to be false, or in this case, we'll just write a 0. We can do this as follows. So the initial state for delta would be delta.iState. And if we want to initialize that as false, we can just write that delta.iState is equal to 0. Again, that's referring to the initial state of the node delta. And we can do the same for notch and NICD. Let's also declare those as false. So let's write notch.iState equals 0. And NICD.iState equal to 0. So our fast parameter is equal to 10, our delta_ext is equal to 0. All three initial states written as iState equal to 0. It's going to conclude all of these specifications, so whatever space you may have left before the beginning of the steppable, you can just go ahead and remove that. Maybe you have something like what I have here on my screen. I'm going to move onward very quickly. We have a couple more things to accomplish here. First, we're going to do a little bit of work with the random library, in particular with doing some random or pseudo-random number generator seeding. So let's go up to the top, and just after our import statement should be around line 2. Can go to the end of what should be around line 2 where the import statement is, and return a couple of times. And let's go ahead and grab the import, or let's do the import of the random library. We can do that by just typing import random. We'll use that here momentarily. Actually, we'll use that right now. So what we will do is do a little bit of seeding of the random number generator, which is a way of making sure that every time we run a simulation, we'll get a different set of random numbers generated by the random number generators behind MaBoSS. If you're interested in the particularities, we can discuss that after this module. For now, believe me when I say that you can generate a different set of random numbers by below the import statement, returning a couple of lines and just typing random.seed. Call that as a function, no arguments, random.seed. Now, while you're doing that, also, we're going to declare one parameter that's particular to MaBoSS itself, which is describing the amount of time that elapses every time a state transition is considered. And when I say a state transition, I mean every possible state transition once. So every node that has a state transition defined on it, each of those will be considered. And the amount of time that corresponds to in simulation is referred to as the time tick. Now, while we're up here at the top of our script, let's go ahead and declare a value for our time tick. In this case, let's give it a name. So this model parameter will hold the value of the time tick for our simulations. In this case, we'll call our time tick time_tick, and that will be equal to 0.2. Without specification of the actual units, this could be minutes, seconds, hours, months. Probably not for a delta notch model, but in general, we're being intentionally vague here. We'll just say that time tick is equal to 0.2. We'll use that to configure our MaBoSS simulations, which I believe we'll be getting to next. So imported random, we called random.seed as a function with no arguments. That'll seed the random generator with the time on your computer, and then time tick equal to 2. Giuliano asks, do we need to seed, call random.seed? In the case of CompuCell, no. In the case of MaBoSS, yes. We may go through and add in similar functionality to CompuCell. CompuCell will do something similar on its own. That functionality is not written into the MaBoSS integration in CompuCell currently. So for now, we're just going to call random.seed. Okay, let's continue on. And let's go actually attach some MaBoSS simulations to some cells. So we've got our network. We can now build some actual MaBoSS model instances with our network and our simulation configuration. Let's do that similarly to how we did when we were working with Josh yesterday. And we're going to do that by using a function that should look similar to what was used with antimony model attachment to cells. In this case, we're going to use a steppable function that's called add MaBoSS to cell. So we had add antimony to cell. We have also add SBML to cell. We have add cellML to cell. Now we also have add MaBoSS to cell. And that function has quite a few arguments, just like with adding an antimony model. Those are all listed here. We'll keep those as a reference on the next slide while we're actually doing this, and we'll talk through it, which there are actually more arguments available than what are listed here, and you can refer to the documentation that was provided. A link to was provided in the chat earlier. So for now, let's just go through it very quickly. Describe a cell to attach to, give the model a name, just like an antimony, pass our strings for our network specification and our configuration, and then we can define things like the amount of time for an integration step, specify the value of our time tick, and provide, say, something like a seed for the random number generator. So we're going to do that here now by moving to our start function. So if you've been working closely with me, this should be somewhere around line 50. I'm going to go to the comment that's automatically populated in the start function for our Steppables. So let's go to the end of that string and return. We're going to work in the start function, and let's just do a loop over every cell in our simulation. And for every one of those cells, we're going to attach one MaBoSS model. So let's do that. For those of you who like the code snippets, the item is under CC3D Python, then visit, and then which one is it? All cells. I'm just going to type it for cell in self dot cell underscore list. Iterating over every cell in simulation, hit return. Twedit should add an indent for you. And we're just going to call self.add MaBoSS to cell. So for cell in self.cell list, we're going to call on this cell self.add MaBoSS to cell. Let's go ahead and start our arguments. The first argument that we'll pass is the cell to attach the MaBoSS simulation to. We can do that by typing cell equals cell. The first cell being the keyword, the name of the keyword argument, and then the second being the value, which is the cell that we're iterating over. Second argument, going to specify the name of the model by which we can refer to the model later when we do actual interactions with it. In this case, the keyword is model underscore name, and let's give it a name that's a string delta underscore notch. So model underscore name equals the string delta notch. That's the name of the model. We use that to get this model later. And now let's pass our network specification and our configuration. So third argument to pass the network description, BND underscore STR is the keyword. We can just type equals our actual network specification string, which I just so happen to have named the exact same as the keyword, BND underscore STR. So that's passing the description of the network. Let's do the same for now the configuration. This will be CFG underscore STR equals the multi-line string for our configuration, which just so happens to have been named CFG underscore STR. And then lastly, specify 3 more arguments. The first being the amount of time that corresponds to stepping the model 1 time. That is the keyword time underscore step. So this is the amount of time per integration step, not necessarily the same as the time tick. We'll say time step equals, and let's just keep things simple and declare it the same as our time tick. Now we'll pass the actual value of the time tick, which also just so happens to have the keyword of time underscore tick. And let's pass our time tick, which we declared to have the same name, time underscore tick. And then lastly, we're just going to generate a random seed for each simulation that's created. We can do that with the final argument called seed. And we're just going to generate a random integer from 0 to 1 billion. And we can do that with a function defined in the random library. And that function is randint, R-A-N-D-I-N-T. It's a little snippet right here for your reference. This will return a random integer between 0 and 1 billion. Excuse me. So we'll say that seed is equal to random.randint from 0. I'm going to cast 1e9 to an int. And then complete the arguments for the function, randint, and then complete the arguments for self.add MaBoSS to cell. So loop over every cell, attach a MaBoSS model, and I have the name delta underscore notch. It has our network and configuration strings. We specified a time step equal to our time tick. We've also specified a time tick equal to our time tick. And then we're seeding each MaBoSS simulation with a randomly selected integer between 0 and 1 billion. Okay, let's continue. I'm going to blast through these very quickly. So here there's a select list of ways to be able to interact with every MaBoSS model that's been created in CompuCell. So this is not something that's true for, say, MaBoSS proper. This is true for the actual implementation that's integrated within CompuCell. So for example, just like how we yesterday went through accessing SBML models that have been created from antimony model strings, we would type something like cell.sbml dot, and then specify the name of the model that we would like to interact with. The same is true for MaBoSS, except that now, in the case for MaBoSS network models, we type cell.MaBoSS dot, and then the name of our model, where the name of the model corresponds to what's passed here during creation of the model in the first place. we've been using delta underscore notch. So now to get the delta notch model attached to a cell, we can write cell.MaBoSS.delta notch. That will return the MaBoSS simulation that was created by this call. Now with those MaBoSS model instances, we can interact with them in a lot of different ways. We're just going to look at a few today. But again, the documentation describe all of the other different ways that you can interact with those models. In the case of actually getting one of the nodes that we've defined, we have our delta, notch, and NICD nodes. If we'd like to be able to get one of those nodes and interact with it individually, we can refer to it like a dictionary on the actual MaBoSS model that we've retrieved. So if we write cell.MaBoSS.myModel to get a MaBoSS model named myModel, we can get a node named NICD in that network by just using the name of the node as a key when accessing like a dictionary. And we'll go through a little bit more to do with that, but for now we can also set things like model parameters like our delta ext, or also our model parameter called fast that we specified in MaBoSS. We can also access those going a little bit further into some of the things that are defined on the MaBoSS model per se. And in this case, for interacting with the model parameters, we can use another dictionary type accessing method. In this case, if we have some cell.MaBoSS.myModel for some MaBoSS model named myModel, we can get the name of any model parameter defined by typing .network.symbolTable. So in the case for our delta ext, we'll write something like cell.MaBoSS.delta notch.network.symbolTable, and then specify a key equal to delta ext. Now, if you use the code snippet, you may have some additional arguments that were generated for you, like having to do with discrete time. You can remove all of the other arguments that have not been specified here. We're just going to use the defaults. Discrete time in that case actually refers to some of the various integrators that are supported by MaBoSS. By default, discrete time is set to false in the case of the CompuCell implementation, and what that refers to is using a stochastic Gillespie solver when doing integration. Whereas if you were to pass discrete time equals true, then you would do deterministic integration. Okay, and then lastly, before we get back to typing, we had our self.timestep SBML to do automatic integration of every SBML model in simulation. There's a corresponding method for MaBoSS called self.timestep MaBoSS, also called with no arguments. So self.timestep_MaBoSS, no arguments. All right, now let's get to some coding very quickly. We don't eat up all of Julio's time for the next two modules. Let's head down to our step function and let's actually do this. So what we will do is we will go through every cell and we want to define the interactions of the delta notch models between individual cells that are in contact with each other. Delta notch signaling is contact mediated. So we'll do a loop over every cell in simulation. And then we'll look at every neighbor of every cell, and we'll count all of the common surface area that a particular cell has with neighbors when the neighbors are delta expressing. In terms of the network model, every neighbor that has a delta node with a true state. And so let's do that. So if you use the TWEDIC code generator, you may already have a cell list started for you. We're going to use that. So step function is going to start with for self and self dot. And let's return. And let's start by just getting our delta notch network model for this cell. And we can do that by, say, let's declare the name of our variable MaBoSS underscore model and say that is equal to, in this case, it'll be cell.MaBoSS dot, referring to the model name, delta underscore notch. So that is the MaBoSS model created by this call for this cell. And now we will do a summation over all of our neighbors for this particular cell. Our end goal being to actually set the MaBoSS model parameter that we defined earlier, the one called delta underscore ext. What we are doing here is we are calculating the current value of delta ext in our network model, and we're going to cast that as being in terms of neighborhood conditions of this cell, where delta ext will be the summation of the surface area that this cell has with every neighboring cell whose delta node state is high or true. And so let's do that. So let's name our summation variable. We'll just set it to 0 for now. We'll call it num underscore delta underscore ext. And we'll initialize that as being equal to 0. We're going to add to that as we do a loop over the neighbors of the cell. Now let's do a loop over the cell list or the neighbors of this cell. We can do that with twetit in CC3D Python, visit, and cell neighbors. I'm going to write it manually. I'm going to write for, and we get a neighbor cell object and the common surface area returned by this call self.get cell neighbor data list when passing our cell as an argument. So we'll return every neighbor and the corresponding common surface area with that neighbor that corresponds to this cell that's been passed. Now, the neighbors that can be returned includes the medium, which has no MaBoSS model. And so we don't want to do anything with the medium because it doesn't have a MaBoSS model to work with, the medium being represented with none in CompuCell. So in this case, we can only consider actual cells by just typing if neighbor. And then once we're in this conditional that's only looking at the actual cells in the neighbor list, now let's get the actual MaBoSS model of the neighbor cell. In which case we can do something like neighbor underscore MaBoSS underscore model equals, and we'll access it the same way as we got the MaBoSS model for the cell that we're currently considering. And we can do that by typing neighbor.MaBoSS dot delta underscore notch, referring to the name of the model. So this is the MaBoSS model of the cell we're considering. This is the MaBoSS model of the neighbor that we're considering for the cell we're considering. And all we'll do is just count the common surface area, add that into our running summation for this cell, but only if the neighbor's delta state is true, and we can do that just by casting that state to 1 or to an int. Now we can get the state of a node as an attribute just called state. So again, to get the node of this neighbor, in particular the delta node, we can write neighbor MaBoSS model, and then like a dictionary, just pass the name of the node that we would like as a key. That is the delta node of this MaBoSS model. Now, if we'd like the state of that node, the current state, we can just type .state, just like that. So the delta node of the neighbor MaBoSS model, get its state. We want to add the common surface area to our running summation if the delta state is true, in which case we can do something fancy like this. Let's just cast it to an int. If the delta node state is true, then casting it to an int will make it equal to 1. Likewise, if it's false, it'll cast to an int of 0. We can just multiply by the common surface area for this particular cell, which is returned in the iterator. And now let's just add that to our running sum, which was num delta ext. And we can just then say num delta ext plus equals, and then int of the state of the delta node in the neighbor MaBoSS model times the common surface area. Can they be neighbors and the CSA be 0? Question in the chat. No. No, they cannot. But of course, the neighbor's state for the delta node could be false. So that's the feasible way here that nothing is actually being added to our running sum for this particular neighbor. We look at a neighbor that's not expressing delta. Its node state for delta is false. But no, the common surface area will not be 0. Okay, so we have our sum. Now, after our sum, let's get out of this neighbor loop and get back to our cell loop so we can do a return after what on my screen is around line 72. Let's reduce our level of indentation back to alignment for the cell loop. And now the last thing that we'll do here is add that to the delta ext parameter for this MaBoSS model. And the delta ext is used when determining the logic of the notch node and also determining the upward rate of the notch node. And so we're going to set the notch or the delta ext model or model parameter for this network according to what this sum turned out to be. So this will be different for every cell. And so every MaBoSS model, every one attached to each individual cell could have a totally different value. And that's all according to the neighbor conditions of the cell. So let's do that. Let's start by referring to our MaBoSS model for our cell, MaBoSS model. And now, as a reminder, we can access the model parameters for a MaBoSS model by typing .network .symbol_table. So the MaBoSS model .network .symbol_table, and then like a dictionary, refer to the name of the parameter that we would like to do something with. In this case, it would be a string for delta_ext. So that is the delta ext that corresponds to this MaBoSS model. And maybe you guessed it, we're going to set it to the summation that we just calculated. In this case, we're going to cast this to a float because MaBoSS will use these model parameters as floats. Just going to keep it safe here and just do an explicit cast to make sure we get no mysterious crashes. So let's say equals float and then num delta ext. All right, we're running way behind, so I'm just going to keep pushing through this so we can actually see this happen, if anything, so that everyone can just see it work on mine. We can work together after this module if you're more interested in diving into the details of this. We're just going to blast right through this very quickly. Next thing that we need to do here, so after we've updated the configuration model parameters, we're going to start a new line and go back to the level of indentation for the method for step. I'm just going to time step the MaBoSS models that have been created for this simulation. Again, we can do that with self.time step underscore MaBoSS. Call that with no arguments. That's like time step SBML. And now the next thing we're going to do, this is to finish, is to update the type of our cells based on the new state of our network. So we've updated the parameters of the network based on local conditions in CompuCell. We've integrated the MaBoSS models with those new parameters, and now we're going to have some feedback back from the network back into CompuCell by updating the types of the CompuCell 3D cell types, and that's going to be governed by the state of the network for each cell. We'll do this by starting another loop over all cells or cell in self.celllist. The first thing that we'll do is we're going to get the MaBoSS model for this cell again. So we can say MaBoSS model equals cell.MaBoSS.delta notch. That's our delta notch MaBoSS model for this particular cell. Now let's go ahead and get the actual state of both the delta and notch nodes for this MaBoSS model. Let's name them delta and notch accordingly. We're going to get the actual states, not the nodes themselves. We're just going to name them as delta and notch to keep this intuitive. So let's say, for example, delta, which will be the state of delta, equals, and that'll be our MaBoSS model. Let's get the delta node, again, accessed like a dictionary, using the name of the node as a key. And let's get the state, which again is dot state. So delta is equal to the state of the delta node of this cell's MaBoSS model. Likewise, the notch state is equal to MaBoSS model notch, like a dictionary, dot state. And maybe you guessed it from the very beginning of our time together this morning, we're going to update the inactive delta, notch, or both types based on these two states. Inactive corresponding to when both notch and delta are false. Delta corresponding to when only delta is high. Notch, likewise, only when the notch state is high, and both corresponding to when both are high. And we can very quickly write that as follows. If delta, and then in this case, either notch can be high or low. If notch is low, just to say if not notch, then cell.type equals self.delta. Otherwise, cell.type equals self.both. So if delta is high and notch is low, then the type is delta. If delta is high and notch is high, cell type becomes both. Then if only notch is high, so this is in the case of notch but not delta, by virtue of the elif, then the cell's type is equal to self.notch. And lastly, by virtue of the else, now we're referring to when both delta and notch are low, we get cell.type equals self.inactive. So the CompuCell cell types change based on the current state of the network. That completes all of this with only negative 21 minutes to spare. Let's go ahead and try this out. Can open this in Player. Likely you'll have some errors and some bugs. I fully expect to find some in mine. But once we get that all figured out, then we'll have a working simulation. So go ahead and give everyone just a couple of minutes, work through your tracebacks, reach out to an instructor or just enter anything into the chat if you have some sort of issue. And of course, refer to the code that I have up on my screen for those of you who may need a little bit more time while I'm getting this loaded up into my local installation of Player. All right, give everyone another couple of minutes. I'm going to test mine on one of my other monitors so as to not interfere with anyone who may be using my code as a reference. And I'm going to debug mine as well. All right, so for the sake of time and getting to move on to work with Julio some more, I'm going to move my Player over to my main monitor. And if you got through your debugging in time, then great. Maybe you'll get something like what I have. If you didn't, no worries. We can work together in the private chat on the break or in the hackathon or after hours, no problem. My apologies for this taking an obscenely long amount of time, but let's see this go. So I've already queued this up, and in my case, I've got inactive cells shown as blue. I've stepped this once, so this is beginning in the initial state. And in my case, when my cells type goes to delta, which was the case that corresponds to when only the delta node state of that cell is high, those will be shown as green. Red for likewise sort of downstream when only the notch state is true. And then they'll show as black in the transient state of both the notch and delta states being high. So let's see if it works. So we would expect from something like a delta notch model, like we went through yesterday with Josh, we'll get some sort of patterning, and what do you know, there it is. So we got delta expressing cells resolving contacts with other delta cells, where inevitably one cell or the other must switch their state. And so you'll see that here, except that in this case, you can do lots of interesting things where you say include things like migration that will bring two delta expressing cells into contact with each other, whether by collective cell migration or just plain motility, totally random. You see them have to resolve these sorts of scenarios. And so you'll see that where you have these very quick little switches to being inactive. Occasionally you'll see one where both states are high, in which case it'll show as black. But you see this sort of robustness where you can get this somewhat dynamic, but mostly stable pattern for delta notch signaling. Okay, James, I'm going to turn it back over to you now. Thank you all very much for bearing with me on this. Again, it was a pleasure getting to show all of you this very new, very cool work. And I very much look forward to being able to work with those of you who might be interested in this for your hackathon project.
Okay, thank you, TJ. Appreciate, of course, we lost a little time because of the in the internet problem. So you didn't run over quite as much as you think, I think. Please do fill out the end of module questionnaire. Appreciate it. And why don't we take a 10-minute break and be back here at 12:35 for Julio. Are you here, Julio? Yes, Julio's here for Julio's presentation. He's going to show us about links and compartmental cells and epithelia and these kinds of things, which I think people are quite interested in as well. How many people were able to get the MaBoSS demo to work? Just as a curiosity, maybe a show of hands. It's good. At least one person got it to work. That's good. Yes. Yes. So multiple people were able to do that. That's great. I have to say I haven't tried it yet, so I need to go back and listen to your lecture again and do it myself. Okay, good. Well, let's give ourselves a little bit more time. Let's say 12:40. We'll start back. All right.